at the end of term when everybody's tired, eagerly seeking extra credit or intellectual respite or something else. Hopefully no one will fall asleep or text too much or that kind of thing. All right, well, thanks for being here. I'm Christopher Nichols. I'm a historian at OSU, and I have several roles here to play, so I'll try to keep it relatively brief. I'm the lead organizer for this panel, for this series, Citizenship and Crisis, working with Professor Ben Mutzler and Joseph Orozco. I also have the honor and the privilege of handling the introduction today for a scholar who I deeply respect, Christopher Capozzola of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So we're fortunate to have Professor Christopher Capozzola here, Associate Professor of History at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In fact, we've had him here, we've been having the pleasure of hosting him here for several days in Oregon. We've done panels and discussions in Portland on Monday. He kindly visited and co-taught a class with me yesterday. And now we're in for a treat with his talk, I think. He holds degrees from Harvard and Columbia. He's an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. He specializes in the political and cultural history of the U.S. from the late 19th century to the present, with an emphasis on legal history, war in the military, and the history of international migration, among other topics. He's won too many awards and grants for me to list all of them here, but I'll name just a few to give you a sense of how accomplished he is. In 2009, he won the James A. and Ruth Levitan Award for Excellence in Teaching in the School of Humanities, Arts, and Sciences at MIT. He's been awarded prestigious fellowships from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Carnegie Corporation, Charles Warren Center at Harvard, Library of Congress, National Endowment of the Humanities, and I could go on, but I'll leave it at that for now. In my view, his is a capacious political historical approach, and he's a public intellectual and an engaged scholar in the best sense of those terms. He's appeared on a number of television programs, he's written op-eds and op-essays in publications like The Nation, Washington Post, The Globe. He's a co-curator of the exhibit, The Volunteers, Americans Joined World War I, 1914 to 1919, which is the largest historical exhibition commemorating the centennial of World War I. His insights tend to combine, I'd say, sort of analysis of war, politics, law, foreign relations, and citizenship, but often focusing on sort of bottom-up analysis, people, their real lived experiences of these kinds of often far too abstract concepts and patterns in historical interpretation. His groundbreaking book, Uncle Sam Wants You, World War I and the Making of the Modern American Citizen, published by Oxford, in large part a basis for this talk, won the 2010 Lois P. Rudnick Best Book Prize of the New England American Studies Association, and a formative article in stemming from that, or helping to generate that, was the first work of his that I read, and deeply informs my own work. As it intensively interrogates the relationship between citizens, voluntary associations, the federal government, the World War I national state through explorations of military conscription, conscientious objection, homefront voluntarism, regulation of enemy aliens, and the emergence of civil liberties movements. This is all generated in the World War I context. His current research brings together his interest in citizenship, the military, and migration, and is entitled Brothers of the Pacific, some of which we heard about today and had the great pleasure to talk about. This work is a transnational history of American soldiers in the Philippines and Filipino soldiers in the US in the 20th century. But what I'd like to emphasize before I end this overly long and overly effusive introduction of Christopher Capozzola is what's likely to be on display here today. His work is deeply grounded in archival research. It's intellectually penetrating, but what's maybe most impressive is the tremendous narrative verve that he brings to writing history. His eloquent historical work on how Americans remade their understandings of the relationship between the state and citizen in the crucible of World War I, when the fervent production of wartime loyalty collided with weaker voices crying out about civil liberties and dissent, challenges us to understand this history in new ways. It also compels us to address the central questions at stake in society today and in this series, I would argue. Questions like, what is a citizen? What can the state legitimately demand of its citizens? How can or should individuals construct their own roles as citizens, or adapt, alter, reject, oppose state actions cloaked in the demands of patriotism or nationalism, particularly important in times of crisis? The implications of Capozzola's articles, essays, and books on this and related topics bring us right up to the present and are really poignant in society today. We now live with the massive structures of state power that were first constructed in World War I, which he's illuminated so beautifully, and we share many of that generation's obligations, I would argue, as well as its anxieties. And as historian Daniel Rogers once asked in writing a review of Chris's book, this history demands us to address and seek to answer one fundamental question: can we learn from their mistakes? And I hope we can, and I hope you'll illuminate a few of those ways today. So please help me in welcoming Professor Christopher Capozzola.
Thank you to Professor Nichols. He's done such a good job of summarizing my work that I'm not sure that I need to continue. So thank you very much for that, and thank you to everyone who's been a great host for me today, and also to Bob and Johnny for putting everything together logistically. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about citizenship and crisis, by starting not in the past but in the present. And since that is the theme of the workshops here, and just ask you all to think for a minute about both of those things. First, this is, as in many historical periods, but I think for a lot of us in the last year or so, a time of international crisis, and crisis in places in the world that we may not have been familiar with before. So just ask yourself, and if you're willing to raise your hand and show us, how many of you in the last year have looked up on the map a place like Syria, or the Ukraine, or Gaza, or someplace like that? Okay, almost everyone, right? So there's crisis and mapping. Now I'm going to ask you a very different question, which is about citizenship, right? And you don't have to raise your hands for this one, but I want you to just think, right? How do you know who you are as a citizen? How do you document your political identity? If someone stopped you on the street as you walked out of this room and said, prove to me that you are who you say you are, whether you're a citizen, immigrant, or a sort of visiting tourist or something else, right? How would you prove it? Just sort of think about that for a second. Okay. And so now what I'm going to do is sort of back into 100 years ago, to other moments when people were looking at a world in crisis, and other moments when people had to confront this question of who they were, literally, as citizens. Okay. I'm going to start with the beginning of the First World War, because in that first moment at the beginning of the war, people everywhere, in the United States in particular, clamored for maps. And this is one of my favorite things that I came across when I was doing research for my book. This is the front page of the Seattle Star on August 1st, 1914. And I don't know if you can read the headline at the very top that says, "Cut out this map and follow moves of European war." Right? So it was sort of encouraging you as a newspaper reader to sort of take some scissors and sort of use this to kind of figure out what was happening in the war in Europe. In 1914, Americans read atlases, they tore maps out of newspaper supplements like this one, they even gathered around kiosks in town squares. And this happened all over the country. It also happened here in Oregon. The city of Klamath Falls, for the period of the war, ran a public bulletin board where they would put post-war news, and a war map, a giant war map, was on display in the lobby of the Portland Public Library for most of the war. People were looking for the war, curious to find new names of unfamiliar places. Sarajevo and Gallipoli, Verdun, and ultimately Versailles, hopeful that they could sort of somehow make sense of the war by finding a place for it on the map. And I think in some ways they did. But what I also want to suggest is that as they did that, as people looked for the war on the maps, they were also looking for themselves on the map. And they were mapping themselves and pinpointing themselves somewhere in a global world, as Americans were discovering where they fit in a world in crisis. And what I want to do today is track the ways in which what it meant to be an American, in the most narrow sense, who was in and who was out, who was a citizen and who was not, transformed dramatically in the years between 1914 and 1924. 1914 marks the beginning of the First World War. The war ends in 1918. I picked the date of 1924 because that's the year that the U.S. passes a large immigration restriction law that effectively brings sort of the large-scale migration of Europeans to the United States to, not to a complete end, but drastically reduces it. Here, what I want to explain is one of the most puzzling photographs that I have encountered. This is a picture of President Calvin Coolidge signing the law, the Immigration Restriction Act that I just mentioned, which was known as the Johnson-Reed Act. But the puzzling part is look who's standing behind him. Right? Over his right shoulder, on our far left, is General John Pershing, the leading soldier in the American Expeditionary Forces, America's chief military officer. So the puzzling part is, what is America's wartime military hero doing watching Calvin Coolidge sign a bill that would exclude hundreds of thousands of immigrants from entry into the United States? And I think to me, the point is that those two events are connected. That by 1924, ideas and rules about citizenship had become more uniform. They were focused around a single allegiance, that you were to owe allegiance to just one country, even if you were an immigrant. That those were documented in paperwork in ways that they had never been before, and they were managed by the federal government, a government that had far more power to regulate the borders of citizenship and alienage, the outsider status, after World War I and because of World War I. Okay. So as I'm talking here today, I'm going to focus on a pretty narrow definition of citizenship. Whether you are sort of an official member of the U.S. government. There are other meanings for citizenship, and if you come to all of the events that Professor Nichols has put together, you'll get a sense of how varied those definitions can be. And some of those definitions include sort of more cultural definitions, whether you feel like you belong as an American, whether you feel an emotional attachment to the United States or to your fellow Americans, whether you feel equal to other Americans and have a sense that your citizenship is an egalitarian citizenship. And I think all of those need to get examined. But for today, I really want to focus, because I'm going to focus a lot on war and immigration and citizenship in times of crisis, I'm going to focus on the more narrow definition. Good? And I want to start with the first thing that brings large-scale immigration to an end, which is not this law in 1924, but the war itself. Right here we see a picture of the immigration processing facility at Ellis Island. And in fact, immigration from Europe to the United States drops precipitously as early as the summer of 1914. And we can think about reasons why that might be. First of all, the various countries that are going to war in Europe start instituting a draft and drafting soldiers in their countries. And when they do that, that taps a lot of the young men who might have made up the immigrants went through Ellis Island. Those countries also start mobilizing their economies and their agricultural economies as well as industrial economies. So suddenly there are lots and lots of jobs for people in Europe, which might make it less sort of necessary to cross the ocean to America to get a job. Third, it's also a lot more dangerous to cross the Atlantic Ocean to get to the United States because submarine warfare begins by late 1914, and passenger ship travel is either difficult or expensive or risky, and you might want to just stay in Europe rather than risk submarine warfare. By April of 1917, Ellis Island was essentially empty. And in fact, during the American period of the war, from April of 17 to November of 1918, the U.S. government actually used it as a prison for anti-war radicals or for enemy aliens. Just to give you some numbers, the peak of migration from Europe to the United States peaks in 1914 at 1.06 million. Right, so just over 1 million immigrants entered the United States from Europe in 1914. In 1915, that drops to 198,000. Right, so that's a massive drop in just the space of 1 year. And it would not return to the pre-World War I levels on an objective level until the 1990s. Right? It's only in the 1990s that you see the number of migration entries to the United States hitting 1 million again. And if you think about it, if you adjust for the base population of the United States, which of course now has 300 million people in it, in 1917 it had 100 million people in it, right? Immigration rates have never been as high as they were in 1914. right? So we have never really gone back to the world that we lived in then. Now that's not to say that there weren't people migrating, either within the United States or to the United States from other areas. And I want to talk about two key places where we can see this going on. The first is at the U.S Mexico border. And it's important to remember that during the same time that Europe is in crisis, Mexico is also in crisis, in revolution and civil war that lasts from 1910 to the early 1920s. The war displaces many people from Mexico. About 100,000 flee across the border as political refugees or displaced persons who sort of basically have to flee their homes. But a lot also come as economic migrants. Right? Remember I said that the war economies are booming. That includes the United States. There's lots of jobs in the U.S. But there are also suddenly very few immigrants entering to take them. But the borders are open between the United States and Mexico, largely. And this makes it possible for large numbers of Mexicans to migrate to the United States. And Mexican-American communities of the 20th and 21st centuries are really sort of date back in some ways to this period. I should explain what you're actually looking at here in this picture. In the center is Pancho Villa, one of the leaders of the Mexican Revolution. On the right is a guy you've seen before, General John J. Pershing, right, who was the leading figure in the U.S. actions on the Mexican border. Now, there are also public policies related to Mexican migrant labor that begin in World War I. It starts with the formal recruitment of 70,000 Mexican workers as temporary agricultural guest workers to deal with the harvest of 1918, when drafted soldiers were out of the country. And this marks the beginning of the large-scale recruitment of Mexican workers that would be repeated in the Bracero program in the 1940s, and will continue into the 1950s, and that in many ways shapes sort of cultural assumptions that Mexican migrants are best understood as temporary laborers with no purchase of national citizenship. So that's one group of people who are very much affected by the war. The second are migrations of people within the United States, African Americans, and the First World War marks the beginning of the so-called Great Migration, a large-scale migration of African Americans out of the rural South to urban centers, either in the South or in the North and West. By the end of the Second World War, 30 years later, nearly 9 million white and black Southerners had left the South for other destinations. This migration begins during the war, and it has particular meaning for African Americans who are both pulled to the North for jobs and pushed out by the structures of Jim Crow and discrimination that they are seeking to avoid. They are also recruited as laborers by northern enterprises. They also draw on the infusion of dollars in the booming economy into what was a very cash-poor South. And this generates large-scale migrations over 2 generations. By relocating, many African-American Southerners remade the terms of political participation, moved into places where they could vote when they had never done so before, for example. But they also confronted limits and discrimination and segregation in the North that were maybe less legal and formal, but no less severe in their implications. So it reminds us that citizenship is not just a formal category of belonging. These are people who are always technically citizens of the United States, but also we need to attend to the ways in which whether African Americans were treated as equal citizens and as full citizens. So that gives you a sense of sort of people's movements and how they're very quickly transformed by the beginning of the war. And then one of the things that happens when everyone starts moving around and governments start needing you to do things is that you need to start identifying the citizens of your country. Okay? And let me just pass through here. Right? By 1918, it became urgent, or 17, when the U.S. enters the war, it became urgent to identify who American citizens were, in part because we had instituted a draft. The Selective Service Act of 1917 required that all male persons in the United States between the ages of 18 and 45 register for the draft and carry on their persons at all times their draft registration cards. These are the first mass state-issued identity documents in U.S. history. Right? The first time that the government systematically set out to identify with a legal authority who a person was. If you think about it, this is the era before there are really driver's licenses. Most places you don't need a driver's license to drive in 1917, and most people didn't drive anyway. There's no Social Security Act, so there's no Social Security numbers. There are basically no passports. A few people might have had visas if they were immigrants, but most people didn't, and you didn't actually need one for international travel. And birth certificates were a recent invention of progressive reformers who felt that it was important to sort of document whose children were who. Many people's identities were recorded only in parish registers or family Bibles, or even really only in family oral history and lore. So identifying who is between 18 and 45, just so that they can be called up in the draft, is an enormous undertaking. Now, much could ride on this fact. The Selective Service Act assumed that draft age men were liable for service unless they could prove that they were not. Right? So this has a couple of implications. Right? So I asked you how you could prove that you that you were a citizen. I could also ask you if you are not, how could you prove that you are not? Might be almost as challenging, especially if you're in 1917, if you're coming from another country that doesn't have birth certificates or passports. Okay? So about 200,000 non-citizens ended up in the U.S. Army during the First World War. Immigrants who were living in the United States, not citizens of the United States, but they ended up being drafted anyway, often because they were simply unable to document to their draft boards their status as nationals of another state. Right? So if you registered, you might have ended up with a card like this. And what you should notice, this is an Oregon card from a guy named Walter Munger from Looking Glass, Oregon. If anybody is from there, let me know. I'm really curious to know what that sounds like. But notice his age, if you look about halfway down, 49 years old. Right? So this is someone who is not registering for the draft because he wants to serve. He's registering for the draft because he wants the card that can show that he's too old to be in the Army. So that if he's walking down the street and someone says, hey, you're a draft dodger, he can say, no, actually, I'm 49 years old. Leave me alone. Right? So these kinds of efforts are quite common. Because if he doesn't have this card, he might end up in a situation like this. Now, in the First World War, people who dodged the draft were known as slackers, right? That was the slang term from the period, which makes for some interesting computer searches. Lots of different things turn out when I do research. And many people felt that there were too many draft dodgers, and various police officers and military officials started instituting these popular raids where they might surround a movie theater or a baseball stadium, subway entrance, to try to look for the draft cards of every single person. And if they didn't have them, they might end up being hauled away and either registered, or if they were really found in violation, they might be turned over actually to the Army and sent right directly into the service. And these raids were enormous, and they were held all across the country. There definitely was one in Portland in September of 1918. This is a picture from a raid in New York that led to the sort of temporary detention of 50,000 men in New York City. The most unusual thing I think about this picture is that I can't explain is why everyone in the truck is smiling. And I don't have a good answer to that. I think actually this photo is staged, so I hate to ruin the fun for you. I can't imagine that it was that much fun until we rounded up. In any case, so I have to assume that this is actually not a historically accurate photograph. Now, it was just as important to figure out who wasn't a citizen. And to keep an eye on them, particularly if they were citizens of Germany, with which the United States was at war. After April of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson, who you see here, invoked the Alien Enemies Act, which had been on the books since 1798 and had been sort of largely forgotten, but gets dusted off and used to regulate German citizens who are living in the United States, German sort of immigrants or other people who had German citizenship. They were required to register. There were restrictions on where they could live, where they could move, where they could travel, where they could work. There were restrictions on their ownership of various kinds of technical equipment that could be used, including cameras, and also limitations on their ownership of firearms. By the war's end, some 6,000 had been interned as enemy aliens over the course of the war. This is a large-scale internment. Not on the scale of the internment of Japanese Americans a generation later, but in fact actually not quite analogous to it in the sense that everyone who was interned was a citizen of Germany, as opposed to the Second World War when the majority of Japanese American internees were citizens of the United States. And also, German enemy aliens were interned according to the boundaries of international law. Almost all the warring powers in the First World War did this to enemy aliens. Germans did it to the British, British did it to the Germans, etc. But the scrutiny of outsiders and aliens gave a green light to extra-legal repression, and the story of the First World War homefront is one of violence and intimidation for German immigrant communities that leads to threats, violence, church burning, the destruction of German language newspapers, German community halls, that is really quite systematic over the course of the war, almost every day. If you look at a newspaper from 1918 in particular, you'll see episodes of this. Now, I'll give you an example. If you've ever been to Southeast Portland and you drive around, you might come across Bush Street and Pershing Street and Lafayette Street and Ryan Street and Roan Street, if this is ringing any bells. What you might not notice is that those are all names that date back to World War I and have something to do with it. What you should do is then stop and ask, well, what were they called before that? Right? And you might discover that they were called Friedrich Street and Frankfurt Street and Bismarck Street. Right? And that the city of Portland systematically renamed streets that had strong German names during the course of the war. Pinpointing who was and wasn't a citizen during wartime could also sort of end up linking citizenship and military service. Right? Within the ranks of the armed forces, it really mattered whether you were a citizen or not, in part because if you fight for the army of a country that you are not a citizen of, under international law, that makes you a mercenary, and it means that you're not necessarily sort of guaranteed the protections as a prisoner of war that you might otherwise get. Right? So it's very important to the U.S. Army that all of these immigrant soldiers who've just been drafted into the ranks become citizens very quickly. But that has a big long-term implications that people didn't predict at the time. Right? So as I had mentioned, right, this is a very diverse country in 1917 in terms of citizenship, and this at times creates moments of celebration of this kind of diversity. Here you see a poster, this is actually a war bond poster, saying Americans all, and it's in pretty small type, you can't read it from the back, but a list of a sort of very diverse range of names, except there is there might be, it's unclear whether there are any German names on the list or not. But a whole bunch of them are sort of listed in there, and there is some sense of that. But the laws also initially, sorry, I just lost my place here. Right, the laws initially don't make soldiers immediately into citizens. So Congress has to pass a law called the Military Naturalization Act of 1918 that would make it very easy for immigrant soldiers to naturalize. That they no longer had to sort of prove that they were residents or fill out paperwork 3 different times in 3 different courtrooms and so forth. They could do it right in the Army itself. And this is a picture of a military naturalization form. This is, one pager. This is really quite easy. If any of you are, in fact, actually sort of naturalized citizens, I can assure you that you filled out a lot more paperwork than this. Nearly 200,000 soldiers, notice that number is almost exactly the same as the number of drafted immigrant soldiers, naturalized during the war. And the majority of them took out their oaths in military camps in places like around here, the Vancouver Barracks, which is where the largest number of orderly soldiers made their first stop on their way to military service. From there, generally to Camp Loomis in Washington State, and from there to other sites either around the country or in Europe. Now there could be some sort of pressures and resistance to this, or challenges to this. One of the most interesting to me are the challenges to military or to citizenship laws that come from Asian American soldiers in the First World War. Now, American law from 1870 to 1942 barred Asian immigrants from naturalization on the grounds of race. Basically, no Asian person was eligible for naturalization. And that's a law that's passed by Congress. Then, in 1918, Congress passes this thing called the Military Naturalization Act, which says everyone who serves will become a citizen. So you have one law that says this, and one law that says this. Right? And so many Asian American soldiers said, well, this is the newer law. It must obviously trump the older law, and I should become a citizen. Right? And they brought naturalization petitions, they made claims, and many of them, in fact, were naturalized in the immediate aftermath of the war. But there were also challenges to that. And this culminates in a Supreme Court case called Toyota versus U.S. in 1925, where the Supreme Court ruled that a Japanese-American veteran's naturalization was, quote, illegally obtained. And the Supreme Court concluded that it must never have been the intention of Congress to overturn the 1870 law when it passed the 1918 law. And so there were limits to the extent to which military service could open up citizenship for Asian Americans. This picture that you're looking at is, to me, actually one of the more heartbreaking pictures in the list. This is not from World War I. This is actually a picture from the Second World War. The man on the right is a veteran of the First World War, a Japanese-American veteran of the First World War, who, along with his son, is going to be interned in the Second World War. And so the picture they're holding is of the father's World War I sort of service photograph. Right? And so you can see the sort of the ironies and the implications of the limits to citizenship. Now, the war's citizenship regime also made it difficult for people who refused military service, whether on religious grounds or were excluded from it, particularly on the grounds of sex, to claim equal rights of citizenship, either in the legal status or in the broader sense of belonging. Now, some of this is reflected once again in bureaucracy, and I don't have a good picture of this form. There's a lot of pictures of bureaucratic forms in today's talk. But this is from the Naturalization Act after 1922. If you fill out the form, it asks if you, specifically, if you will be willing to take up arms in defense of the United States. Now, this law had been on the books for a while, but it had never actually been asked of people in the middle of the naturalization ceremony. And in fact, many people who were pacifists or conscientious objectors or others refused actually to take that oath. Most notably, a woman named Rosika Schwimmer, who was an immigrant from Austria and who refused on the grounds of her pacifism to take up arms in defense of the country. And she brought a case again to the Supreme Court in 1929, U.S. v. Schwimmer, in which she was denied naturalization. When the court ruling that the fact that she was unwilling to take up arms in defense of the United States suggested that she would not make a good citizen. You might stop and ask, especially if you're looking at this picture, and ask, well, who is this Rosika Schwimmer? And she was 56 years old and female, which means that the likelihood that the army would admit her, even if she had been willing to take up arms, was about zero. Right? But nevertheless, the fact that she was unwilling to make that statement meant that she was excluded from citizenship. And she was not the only one. There are similar ones from Douglas McIntosh, who was a Canadian minister, was refused naturalization, and perhaps most ironically, Marie Bland, who was a British-born woman who had actually spent much of the First World War working as a nurse along the Western Front. But because she was also a pacifist, was denied naturalization on the same grounds as Schwimmer. And even more than that, thousands of people who had claimed conscientious objector status, if they were immigrants, were then denied access to citizenship later on the grounds that they must, because they had taken that claim during the war, they must never have really been willing to become citizens. So we can start to see how decisions that linked military service and citizenship in the first days of the war have long-term consequences, a generation and 2 generations later. Now, it's not just linked to military service, but it's also sort of more rigorously enforced over the course of the war, as more and more federal agencies take up the task of securing the borders, keeping watch on aliens, and excluding them in greater and greater numbers. And so one of the most memorable quotes from the First World War is from the Attorney General, Thomas Gregory, who you see here, who boasted to the American public that, quote, "It is safe to say that never in its history has this country been so thoroughly policed." And he felt that the sort of lawless areas of the home front were sort of very few and far between. Now, much of that was undertaken by civilian agencies and police forces or even temporary forces, but many of them were also using federal laws and federal powers and federal funds that had not been there before. most notably the Espionage and Sedition Acts of April 1917 and May 1918, new powers of deportation that the federal government asserted, and even the power of denaturalization, saying that someone who had been naturalized as an immigrant could find that naturalization canceled. Right? Whereas for most of the years before that, naturalization was a one-way street. Once you were naturalized, it couldn't be taken away from you. After 1918, it could. And much of this work was carried out by the Justice Department's new agency, the Bureau of Investigation. About 14 years later, it changed its name to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. But it gets its start really in the 1910s, just before the war, and expands dramatically during the war. What you're looking at here is its, I think, 25-year-old director. He got an early start on life, J. Edgar Hoover, who would be its director and America's sort of leading crime fighter and sort of surveillance architect for much of the 20th century. But it wasn't just in the FBI. The U.S. Army had a military intelligence division that kept watch on radicals, particularly labor radicals who might cross international borders, which here in the Pacific Northwest meant basically lumber labor organizers, people active in the industrial workers of the world, as well as others, and a small number of South Asian radicals who were active in something called the Ghadar Party, which sought independence from India, were also found themselves under scrutiny in Seattle and Portland. Now, this federal power to police things gets a real kick in the seat of the pants when the Prohibition Amendment is passed and adopted in 1920. And Prohibition is enforced through federal power and also brings a lot of attention to the U.S. border, because a lot of the alcohol that comes into the United States is coming across either the U.S.-Canadian border in through South Florida or in the Caribbean, places that are much more thoroughly policed by federal agents after the war than before it. Right? So what you should see here is this linkage of citizenship and war, increasingly surveilled, increasingly enforced, and increasingly done so by the federal government under the terms of the wartime emergency. Now, those are a bunch of ways in which the federal government is getting more power, but there are also ways in which citizenship changes by resolving long-term debates about who is and isn't a citizen and what those terms are going to be. Things that Americans have been debating for decades, centuries even, that finally during the First World War are resolved very clearly. And one of those is the status of women's suffrage. The question of women's suffrage was actually 60, 70 years old when the war begins, and certainly had been an ongoing political struggle, and there had been some victories, including here in Oregon, which adopts suffrage in 1912 at the state level, but certainly at the national level, that is sort of not clear. And many people actually were doubtful that women would gain the right to vote in every state in the Union, and in fact actually had almost given up on a national strategy, and instead wanted to focus on just winning the right for women in states that were amenable to it, like Oregon, for example. But the war changes this dramatically, right? And the ways in which women's suffrage organizations respond to the war, I think, shows us a lot about this. Right? There are two very different responses. One comes from the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This is the big mainstream organization that middle-class women joined, that older women joined, that more moderate, politically moderate women would tend to join, and then in fact actually had a lot of men as members of it and supporters of it as well. NAWSA, as it was called, comes out at the very beginning of the war, comes out in favor of the war. And they say this war we are in favor of it, we support it, and we are going to put our suffrage advocacy on the side. We are going to put politics aside until victory. We are going to volunteer on behalf of the war effort. We are going to show American men what good citizens women are. NAWSA cancels its annual convention, uses the money to support a hospital for wounded soldiers in France, and says, and basically says, after this war is over, we're going to, and we show you what good citizens we are, we're going to demand the right to vote then. Now, on the other side are women like the ones you see here, who are active in the National Women's Party. These tended to be younger women, more radical women, often inspired by the suffragist movements in England that were happening at the same time period. who said, suffrage is democracy, and this is a war for democracy. And suffrage will not be, we will not wait. We will not be silent for the rights of suffrage. We will not actually put our politics to the side, but we will in fact insist upon them, including protesting in front of the White House, which was the very first time that you see regular systematic protests by activists in front of the White House. Even in the 19th century, there had been no such thing. Now, both of those, the sort of moderate approach and the radical approach, contribute in some fashion, and you can decide which one was the tipping, the driving force to make that happen, to lead to the adoption of the suffrage amendment. So in September of 1918, President Woodrow Wilson endorsed it, went to the Senate, and it was ratified eventually by the United States in August of 1920. Now, whether the 19th Amendment made American women into equal citizens or merely extended the voting rights of some American women, and not even all of those, it was nevertheless an important expansion of citizenship at this time period. And it also brings the suffrage question to a culmination after 70 years of debate. And it also opens up as many questions as it answers. Among them were what were the citizenship status of married women. So under a law called the Marital Expatriation Act of 1907, an American woman who married a foreign man lost her U.S. citizenship. Presumably she took on the citizenship of the man she married, but not all other countries actually worked that way. So some women ended up being citizens of no country whatsoever. And in fact, a significant number of American-born women were forced to register as enemy aliens during the war because they had married German citizens. Right? So women who had never actually been to Germany, been born in the United States, had married German men, lost their U.S. citizenship, become technically German, and were suddenly seen as enemies of America. Now, there were defenders of this procedure. One congressman defended the law as, quote, a good lesson to our American girls to marry American boys. But peace and suffrage changed this dynamic, and in fact there's a law passed in 1922, the Cable Act, that eliminated these citizenship provisions, with one exception, for American women who married Asian men, who continued to be barred from naturalization. But you can see some transformations in this, and the reason I picked this picture is it's a picture of a citizenship class in the early 1920s, but notice how few women are in the class, right? There's actually only one, which suggests ways in which citizenship opportunities were very different for men than they were for women. That said, there are also new laws that allow for the migration of 5,000 war brides from Europe in the immediate aftermath of the war. All right, so let me talk about one last case, which is the ways in which sometimes citizens could be created without their consent during war, which is not a way that we usually think about this sort of story. Usually we imagine people fighting for citizenship, asking for citizenship, but sometimes people become citizens even when they didn't want to be. What I'm looking at here is the experience of Native Americans in the First World War. This is a group of soldiers at Camp Yampeg in Long Island, New York. And about 12,000 Native Americans served in the U.S. Army during the war. And American Indians' sort of political status in 1917 was not entirely uniform in one place or another. About 40% of America's 350,000 Native people were not citizens of the United States. Mostly those who lived on reservation territories, or in the eyes of the U.S. government's formal terms, had, quote, not adopted the habits of civilized life. That's the legal term, not my own. And technically, as non-citizens, Native American non-citizens were exempt from the draft, but they were still required to register. And because they often didn't have ways of proving that they were not citizens of the United States, or that they were citizens of some other Indian nation, for example, many Native people found themselves drafted against their will or without even really full knowledge of what the laws were. A lot of draft board administrators just came to reservations and said, you all need to register and serve. Now, what's interesting is that this also became a moment when Indian nations declared their own sort of sovereignty as nations. And several Native nations declared war on Germany during the First World War, either on their own terms or in alliance with the United States, sometimes with motivations that were more complex than we might imagine at first glance. One of the most interesting people I came across was a guy named Arthur Parker. He was a leading member of the Seneca Nation in New York State, and was president of a group called the Society of American Indians. And he was the primary author of the Onondaga Nation's Declaration of War in the summer of 1918. And that declaration, if you read it, asserts its authority to declare war on the basis of a 1783 treaty that gave the Onondaga Nation its own sovereignty. And it was also justified by various New York State Indian nations' anger at the fact that Germans had mistreated members of their communities who had actually been brought to Germany and displayed in circus sideshows as sort of as almost sort of ethnic oddities. And and many people in both the Seneca and Onondaga nations were so upset about this that they used this as a justification for their declaration of war. But for Parker, it was very important that Native nations declare war on their own terms rather than on Americans. He said, doing so would establish an independent right to act as a nation and not as a war-bound tribe. The Senecas have lost none of their sovereignty since 1812, and a war declaration would serve to emphasize our status. And this is a very different way of thinking about citizenship and military service than we usually encounter. Now, of course, many Native Americans served eagerly and were actually quite proud of their enlistment. The Indian is not a slacker, and I didn't mean to be one, wrote William Leon Wolfe, an Ojibwa student from the Carlisle Indian School. Sam Thundercloud, who was a Winnebago man from Wisconsin, said, "I am fighting for the rights of a country that has not done right by my people." Others asserted their right to sovereignty and in fact tried to claim the exemptions that the law provided for them. On the first day of the draft registration, Navajos in northwestern Arizona chased the Selective Service agent off their lands. Ute in Colorado did the same. That August, several hundred people in southeastern Oklahoma, not all of them native Oklahomans, but from many different ethnic groups, joined something called the Green Corn Rebellion, which planned a march on Washington to overturn the draft law. And in February of 1918, rumors emerged from a tiny settlement of Ibapa, Nevada, where Goshu Indians had refused to register on the grounds that they had once made a treaty of peace with the Americans, quote, "and now you come and want us to fight and we won't do it." Now, federal officials were not sure whether these Indians were being misled by German spies or by Mormon troublemakers, which is in fact what the government thought was happening. But nonetheless, the government wasted no time in sending in troops from Fort Douglas in Utah to crush the rebellion. Right? Now, after the armistice, many Native Americans and their allies clamored for full service. In the words of a December 1918 editorial asking, quote, "If the red man can fight, why can't he vote?" And a November 1919 law granted citizenship to all Native men who had served and attributed that citizenship retroactively to the date of enlistment. The law, though, required veterans to actively seek out citizenship, and few did so. Some of them didn't know that this was an option. Some of them actively rejected the idea of becoming a U.S. citizen. And the campaign continues, and the new rhetoric of service and reward, a sort of social contract vision of citizenship. If you serve, you become a citizen, framed the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. And here is Calvin Coolidge once again. There's no John J. Pershing in this picture this time, but he is surrounded here by a delegation that has come for the signing of the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, one of the shortest citizenship laws in American history that says simply, all non-citizen Indians born within the territorial limits of the United States are citizens of the United States. And I think it's important to understand this not simply as an expansion of citizenship and a sort of a civil rights victory, although for some it was, but also at the same time a coercive inclusion into U.S. polity at this moment in the history of citizenship. That inclusion did not have to be egalitarian. All right, so let me conclude by going back to the question of Ellis Island, right, and the Immigration Act of 1924. Right? Immigration was also an issue that had been in the headlines for decades. Policy was unclear, fights followed one time after another, lots of calls for comprehensive immigration reform that no one party could agree on. This probably sounds familiar to you if you're reading the newspaper. The war really is a turning point in this. The shift begins with the Immigration Act of 1917, which is a big, huge bill that includes 3 key provisions to think about. One is the institution of a literacy test, which is designed to make it hard for poor and illiterate migrants to enter the United States, and it did have that effect. Second was that the 1917 Act includes the establishment of a, quote, Asiatic barred zone that basically extends the exclusions of anti-Chinese immigrant laws to almost all the rest of Asia, with a slight exception for the U.S. territory in the Philippines that you can see there. And third, a ban on entry by those deemed mentally ill, including men and women marked by what was called at the time constitutional psychopathic inferiority, which was a clinical euphemism for homosexuality, a bar that remained on the books until the 1980s. While the 1917 Act excluded relatively few, it begins the drive toward large-scale exclusion. And there's an Immigration Act of 1917, 1918, 1921, 1924, and 1927, all of which make immigration harder and harder for people from Europe and from the small parts of Asia that could still enter the United States. Where we end up is with the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which limits the total migration to 150,000 immigrants a year, with a quota for each country of no more than 2% of the foreign-born of that nationality as of 1890. And that's a long, complicated detail. If you want the full version of how the law works, you can actually look it up on Wikipedia. I checked, the entry is pretty accurate. The most important thing to know is that the law drastically reduces migrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, which is basically almost everyone who had been coming, and also barred the few remaining paths to entry for Japanese immigrants. But also notice what this looks like. What you're looking at is the map of the quotas for the immigration restriction law of 1924. That says how many can come from which particular countries. But if anything, it should remind you of the very first slide that I showed you. Right? Cut out this map to follow moves of European war. Right? Just as in the same way, it helps us explain what John J. Pershing is doing there the day that Calvin Coolidge signs the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. And 1924 is the culmination of all of this, of all of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, the Indian Citizenship Act, and also, much just as importantly, in 1924, the establishment of the U.S. Border Patrol, rolled out on both the Canadian and Mexican borders that summer. And we see by 1924 a new nation in terms of legal definitions of citizenship as well as state structures to influence or to enforce those borders of belonging. So what are those final legacies? They are legal, they are political, they are also cultural and demographic. This shapes who is an American for generations to come. This pushed Americans toward a citizenship that was premised on a single allegiance to one state. Right? That you are a citizen of one place, right? And you owe allegiance to just one of those. And that place is bounded by clear territorial limits. Right? That unclear things like dual citizenship, or sort of married women's unclear citizenship status, right? Or Native Americans who might be citizens of one of Native nations as well as the United States, become almost impossible. And this vision is actually not the actual description of what it's like to live in the United States in this period. Right? There are millions of Americans with complicated political loyalties, different kinds of cultural and linguistic affiliations, people who span nation states. Right? But the terms of U.S. citizenship have been remade, and persons in the United States, all of them, whether they were citizens or not, had mapped a new terrain of citizenship with clearer borders around the nation and new landscape of boundaries within it. And it's something that they first started to map out in the summer of 1914 when they were looking for Sarajevo on a map at the beginning of the war.